Our next speaker has also traveled from afar. Dr. Jacques Leider, who came in from Thailand, where he is the director of l'École Française d'Extrême-Orient. That is the French Institute of East Asian Studies in Chiang Mai, Thailand. You want to pull up your PowerPoint? Yes. He is the head of that institute, and he is trained as a historian and history teacher, specializing in the early modern history of Burma, and he has published on the history of Arakan and early modern Burmese history and Buddhist kingship. He has also done research on Arakanese manuscripts in Yangon from 2001 to 2006. So we're happy to welcome Dr. Leider.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to have been invited to today's conference on ethnicity and situation of human rights issues in the country. It's also well organized and prepared, and I would like to thank the organizer. As a historian who has been involved with the country for many years, and specifically that area of Arakan, I would like to try to make basically 3 points. I think there's a need for greater knowledge on the history of Arakan and the area, and particularly also on the Muslim presence in that area, and most specifically about recent migratory movements that would give us some better background and some better information to explain the violence that we have seen over the last month. The other point, the invention of the Rohingya, maybe for some of you a little bit provocative. It's trying to make the point that I see the Rohingya above all as a political movement that has been successfully branding the name itself, Rohingya, for all Muslims in Rakhine, which is a little bit simplifying the historical reality, I think, and the invention of a historical identity that's sometimes based on rather shaky basis. History is very important. I was told a couple of months ago when I attended a similar event at Columbia University that history wasn't really important and the organizer wasn't very much interested in that. It's a great pleasure here to talk today at a place where I think some more importance is given to this historical and cultural background. And I think what's a key issue from the point of view of a historian is what I would call quest of identities, because that's what I see among both communities. Muslims looking for an identity, call it Rohingya identity. Buddhists also looking at safeguarding and the survival of their own identity and their own culture. So having said that, I'll move on to something that I see as a key concept from a historical and cultural point of view, the idea of a cultural frontier. Because when we're looking at this area, it's very particular, situated between South Asia, the Indic world, and Southeast Asia, Bengal, Islamic Bengal, and Myanmar with its Theravada Buddhist tradition. It's a very particular contest, the frontier. It's also a maritime frontier between land and sea, bridged by economic and cultural networks. That's what historians are exploring, where we see the emergence of what we could call a frontier culture, where there's both a coexistence, cohabitation, but also rivalry and competition. But cultural coexistence in the long-term run has always been a political imperative for the rulers in the area that needed to take account that they have culturally diverse communities. Why I'm talking about that? I'm talking about that because I feel that when I'm looking at the way that current events are presented by those who are specialists of human rights questions or humanitarian questions, it's sometimes looked upon as in a too narrow approach, I think, and we need to broaden and make a broader assessment by looking precisely at the historical background, seeing that the communal crisis as we have it now is in a series of earlier events, very similar ones, where the key words of migration, exodus, deportation, relocation are actually permanent features, even when you're looking at these things in a historical dimension over several centuries. Now, what we're talking about here is, in a larger view, the history of Muslims in Rakhine, in this area. Now, when we're going back to historical timeline in the first millenary, what we know, we have archaeological evidence of Hindu-Buddhist culture in Rakhine, the history of various city-states that we do not know that well because there's definitely not been enough scholarship about this, so we have some white spots or black spots in the historical account. We treat on more safe terrain with the 15th to 18th century early modern period with the emergence of the Marawi Buddhist kingdom that dominated the coast of northeastern Bay of Bengal at the late 16th and 17th centuries. Now, talking about early Muslim presence, we have evidence. We have to see it first in the context of Islam coming to Bengal, 13th century, and then a date 1371, where we have first evidence of a Muslim ruler in Chittagong, definitely an important poor city in that area that we know increasingly more since the 16th century, and evidence of a cultural impact, at least in Arakan, of Muslim civilization flowing over from the Sultanate Bengal in the 15th century. Coins, royal titles, I won't comment in detail on that, but also evidence of trade, particularly the Persian inscription of AD 1495 that my colleague Thibaut Dubert, who is here today, is presently looking at University of Chicago. Muslims in Rakhine, then in the 16th and 17th century, we have much more evidence. The Rakhine Buddhist kingdom is expanding towards the north, and it's attracted by this flourishing port city of Chittagong that since the early 16th century Portuguese sources tell us about a quasi-autonomous Muslim port city that will come under the control of the Rakhine Buddhist kingdom probably around 1580 and going to be an economic pillar of that Arakanese kingdom thanks to its rise in textile production. The aggressive warfare that the Rakhine kings are leading, it's easy to explain because it's fighting and resisting, expanding against two huge neighbors. On the one hand, the Mughal Empire that's expanding towards the east, conquering Bengal after 1580, taking several decades to extend its control over the whole of Bengal. And at that moment, those who had been the instrument of rulers in the Sultanate are fleeing towards the east. What do we know about this? Not very much, but we know something about it through Portuguese sources because the Portuguese are talking about their rivalry with Muslims at the court of Arakan during that time, both politically and commercially, so that we see that Muslims were at the service of the Rakhine kings. And it would probably have been very difficult for the Rakhine rulers if they could not base also on these foreign communities that were integrated into a political and military structure. At the same time that they are expanding, the Rakhine kings are creating towards the north a kind of a buffer zone where they're systematically depopulating the Bengali rural areas to keep a kind of protection, that's why I call it a buffer zone, against invasions from the Mughals, who obviously are going to try to conquer that area. That brings us to the chapter of slave trade. Rakhine kings are known as having been great slave traders. Basically, there's been a political agenda behind. They've been deporting, like all Southeast Asian kings, deporting people and settling them in the Kaladan Valley to use them as agricultural labor. Many of these were also sold as slaves to Portuguese traders and were deported by the Dutch to Java. What could be called has been sometimes called the golden age of the Rakhine kingdom is the late 16th up to the 17th century, and we try to summarize a kind of political and military profile of this kingdom. It's the fact that it has a key edge advantage towards its neighbors because of a navy of several thousand ships and boats that are controlling the seas, roughly from Bengal down to Tenasserim, southeast Burma today. This is not an anti-Muslim kingdom because it's fighting against the Mughals. It's anti-Mughal because it's both using resources, whatever it can muster as resources, to resist against Mughal expansion because there are several campaigns to conquer Chittagong, and Arakan was as well on the agenda. It's also towards its east, towards another powerful kingdom, Burma, anti-Pegu. I call it anti-Pegu because it's mostly directed against Lower Burma, where it tries to control also the seacoast. The Rakhine kings are kings that have to rule over culturally diverse communities. We've been talking about that. They are the Portuguese that were very important. They are Muslims, they are Hindu, they are Buddhists, and it's quite clear that the rulers have to express that they are sovereign lords for all these communities, and it's reflected rather well with these trilingual coins in Sanskrit, in Arakanese, and in Persian. Bengali poetry written on Persian literary models, my colleague Thibault will talk a little bit more about this, reflecting this cultural network in which Rakhine was embedded at that time. In 1666, at the moment that the Mughals are conquering Chittagong, Arakan will increasingly become marginalized because it's losing an economic pillar that was really detrimental and important for its survival. Muslim officers remain embedded in the court structure. We know that from the Arakanese chronicles. They were playing still an important role at that moment, and probably also what we can see now from recent research, persistence of a Persianized elite inside Arakan. But economically, the kingdom is marginal because we never see any English traders, the East India Company, who take any interest in this area. In 1785, the Burmese will conquer Arakan relatively easily, and then what they are doing is really decapitating the Rakhine monarchy. They take away the most revered statue, the Mahamuni statue, they take it to Amarapura. Today this statue is the most revered Buddha statue in Myanmar. At the same time, they deport the whole political and cultural elite. For example, all the Brahmins from the court will be deported, so that it's kind of impossible that the Arakanese monarchy could in any way be resurrected. What they try to do is here, which is relatively new at the time, is to integrate this new conquest into the Myanmar Burmese kingdom. I'm using here the term religious integration both for Buddhist and Muslim, in the way that as Buddhists are concerned, the Sangha, the Buddhist monkhood, is integrated through a process of reform, while on the other hand, the head of the Muslims in Rakhine, Abisha Husseini, will be appointed as the head of all the Muslims of the Arakanese kingdom, which is relatively interesting in the way that the king, Burmese king, had that respect for traditional religious leaders coming from Arakan. But what's then the key event, what remains like a kind of a collective trauma for Rakhine Buddhists until today, are the massive deportations of Arakanese towards Upper Burma that provoked then a massive exodus of the population from Arakan towards Southeast Bengal. Some have been talking about a third or half of the population running away from Arakan at that time. This refugee problem in these times, so you see that there are things that are recurrent on a historical timeline, creates a border problem with the East India Company. We remember that in 1761, the East India Company controls Chittagong and the surrounding area. That leads to the creation of what is today Bangladesh's famous seaside resort, Cox's Bazar, created for the refugees by Hiram Cox, a British officer at the end of the 18th century. This is also creating or even stabilizing existing communities of Rakhine, Marma and Rakhine settlements in the plains of Chittagong and in the Chittagong hill tracts, while at the other time we do not know very much about it, but it's very clear that Muslims who ran away from Rakhine at the same time, they were integrated again into the local Bengali society. 1824, 1826, First Anglo-Burmese War. 1825 is the year that Arakan is occupied by the forces of the East India Company, and this early administration of Arakan was a huge failure. On the side of the Rakhine, they had this hope that the Arakanese monarchy could be resurrected. That provoked local rebellions. Basically, early English administration was a failure because of corruption, because of an extremely exploitative tax regime. But what we see in the number is some kind of demographic recovery then until the middle of the 19th century. The British tried to exploit the area by attracting Bengali labor already at that time for their export rice production. What happens at the end of the 19th century is nothing less than a demographic revolution because of a massive growth of the population in Arakan, mostly in Arakan district, due to immigration. Two types of immigration. On the one hand, important immigration coming in from Burma. That population